Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Madalena, for this wonderful introduction and also for your efforts in setting up this amazing festival. So great, great job. And thank you all for coming back from the break. A tiny note about me, you already introduced me so beautifully, but I am a cultural scholar and an experimental game designer, which I've been making games since 2012. Seems like ancient times, around themes like toxic masculinity, hospice practices, flirtation, eating and trauma, fake news, grief, quantum physics, and climate denial. I guess that's the game that is exhibited here. I also wrote a book called Games and Bereavement, in which I talk about grief and how to design games for and with grievers. And I currently work at Tampere University in Finland. So in my work as a researcher, I'm interested in this question how video games and games more broadly are connected to culture, history, and social power, and how media theory can help us make more interesting games, but also how game making can help us make more interesting research. So in today's talk, I'm gonna expand a bit on what I've already presented at Amaze. How many of you have been to Amaze Festival, actually? So you already have the spoilers, but there are new, exciting contents, so bear with me. 2 spoilers that are already contained in this title. The first one is that video game gardening, so I use video games as an analogy, gardening as an analogy to talk about video games. And it's kind of a thought experiment, so what would happen if we think about video games, the industry and practices around it, as gardening? And more specifically in the small print, the spoiler is that it's colonial botany, so this indicates that it will be about history. And a spoiler that's maybe not contained in a title, but maybe in the image, which you can almost not see, I think, it's going to be the dark parts of history, which is a bit different from how we usually talk about gardening. Yes, so it's going to be uncomfortable. A fair warning, though, this talk will use a lot of silliness, and especially puns, because I believe that puns are really great tools of humanity to learn to actually do the opposite, face some uncomfortable facts without getting defensive. At least that's my personal strategy, and I invite you, if at some point during this talk you become defensive of growing resentment against me or someone else, bear with me, that's like a healthy process for change, I guess. So gardening. When we talk about gardening, we usually talk about it like a romantic view of it, right? So gardening as gardens as retreats, gardening as growing stuff, as tending to a garden, taking care, the beautiful flowers that grow in a garden, James Austen's flower garden, for instance, a place of inspiration, connection in a timeless way, right? Like the good stuff, not the bad screen stuff, computers and so on. This positive view in gardening has also been used to describe the process of game development. So, for instance, we have a person here who is famous, David O'Reilly, the maker of Everything, well, the game Everything. And he describes it in terms of the process of making a game as something organic, right? Like growing something from the inside out, which is different from animation where you have a timeline. Also, there has been a recent trend in gardening games, you might have noticed, and they're usually characterized by a contemplative mood, a relaxing gameplay, and it's almost like they seem to almost provide a refuge from the grind of mainstream gaming, this constant performance-driven, fast, skill-based behavior steeped with award systems and endgames, death, permadeath, and so on. The focus seems to be instead on the visual and auditive beauty, meditation and relaxation. This talk is not about that. Instead, I'm going to look at, what I'm going to do is to look at the roots of gardening. So where does gardening come from? What's its history? And when we when you look around us and we see we are in Europe, we are a lot of Europeans, the history of gardening is deeply entangled with colonialism. Right? So the mission to civilize the world, the mission to appropriate foreign land, land which is often portrayed as a scantily clad woman lounging out in nature, readily available to be grabbed by a white man. Here this man is equipped with a beautiful pink flag shown on a golden pole, which he's showing off to claim the land, right? Right now. In a moment he's going to do that. So in all of this, botany played a really important part. The imperial centers of Europe were all invested to get their hands on the exotic plants around the world and to reimplant them somewhere else in order to symbolically own the territory that the plant was ripped from, right? So in order to kind of claim dominance, right? It's also called the Golden Age, maybe referring to the pole, I don't know. So what does it have to do with video games, though, and why does it matter to begin with? So let me briefly restate who I am and how it matters to me. So I was born as the first of 4 children to 2 white Austrian parents in 1984. This means I was born 209 years after William Baltz made a proposal to the Austrian-Hungarian Empress Maria Theresia to establish trade with India and Africa. The proposal was approved. It was not so bold as it turned out, but I was born 188 years after the body of someone called Angelo Soliman, a black member of the Viennese court, was exhumed, skinned, and exhibited at the Museum of Natural History in Vienna. Vienna is a wonderful place to visit, by the way. I was born 112 years after the Austrian expedition ship Tegethoff arrived in the Arctic Circle, and while drifting randomly in ice, the crew members spotted an archipelago which they named after the emperor, just on the spot. I was born 99 years after Austria-Hungary participated in the Berlin Conference on African colonization. I was born 44 years after my great-grandaunt joined the League of German Girls, the female branch of Hitler Youth. There she was taught valuable lessons on how to best avoid racial defilement, the relationships between Aryans and non-Aryans. I was born 9 years after many Turkish guest workers who had helped build Austrian economy during the 50s were driven out of the country. I was born 11 years before PlayStation 1 and 13 years before the Nintendo 64 console came out in Austria. So when I look at colonial history and video games, this is a kind of baggage I bring with me. As someone who is raised in Europe, as someone steeped in the privilege of being white and in my ancestors' complicity with race-based atrocities. And also as someone who is interested in disentangling the mess and loving to play. So back to my question, what can gardening teach us about video games? Let's start with some definitions, some etymology. The history of the term gardening. So basically the Frankish root gardo means fenced in. An enclosure, something that's closed off from the world. This means that in order for something to be a garden, it must first be shut off from the world around it. And in this enclosure, we make something grow. In the colonial garden is a great example for such an enclosure. It's almost a micro version of the empire itself, right? So the methods of gardening, that's what I'm suggesting, can tell us a lot about the methods of the empire. So how plants, I don't know the pronunciation, become cultivated, and who chooses them, or who names them and maintains them, that tells us something about history. So here's the thought experiment. Let's imagine for a moment that the botanical empire is the games industry. So here are the parallels. Both are systems driven by capitalist motivations. Both use the latest technology to expand and breed desirable consumer products like coffee, chocolate, Call of Duty, right? So here's how I'm gonna compare these two systems. That's kind of the agenda for the talk. First, I will talk about 3 botanical practices: collecting, naming, and pruning, which basically means cutting, and how they might map to game development. And secondly, I will look at agents of empire, who are the workers, and where might be parallels to game work right now. That's maybe the new section that the maze people haven't seen yet. And now these first 2 parts will mainly draw on the dysfunction of the games industry. Quick spoiler. And in the third part, I'll talk about threats to colonial gardening and how we might embrace those threats to decolonize game devs when we plow through our creative work, right? I told you there would be terrible puns. So first, collecting. At the core of colonial botany has been the mission to send out botanical explorers in the so-called New World and bring exotic, unknown plants back home to the imperial center. So strolling around through native lands, discovering plants which no man had seen before, meaning no white man. Of course, there were people around who knew very intimately about these plants, but there you go. It's a bit like a Pokemon Go for botanists. So with roses, you grab a piece of nature, put it in your inventory basically before the French do, right? That's the game. So needless to say, only rich folks could play this kind of travel game. This activity was really highly regarded as a form of nation building, right? So kind of crowdsourcing the nation somehow. So there's a sense of nationalism, which is my best shot at a pun on nature and nationalism. So by collecting and owning plants, the nation is symbolically owned. The nation symbolically owned the land that this plant was taken from. So this was possible, this whole shenanigan, because no credits were given to those who already knew about the plants and who actually lived on that country. So a plant to the empire was only worth something if collected and put into the inventory of the empire, right? Like colonial explorers, game developers like themselves in the role of innovators, venturing out in the unknown terrain of, for instance, folk games and appropriating gameplay principles, right, that just lie around there. So if no one owns a mechanic, it can be sold as innovation. That's kind of the baseline. Only before that, millions of people had used these mechanics, just not in the market that was acknowledged. So one example of this dynamic is rock, paper, scissors. These mechanics traveled from Asia to the West as late as in the 20th century. But before that, they have existed as so-called Santokumiken games. And one of the earliest versions of that is Mushiken, which dates back to 1809. And from the left to the right, you see, in this image to the left, you see the slug, the frog, and the snake, these hand gestures. Video game designers have then picked a similar balancing system for games like StarCraft. Only now they sell these mechanics as innovation and innovative digital culture owned by a certain production empire. Right? Let's move on to in-game mechanics, dynamics. Games also promote the pleasure of invading strange places and picking up unknown items, which are then turned into property or currency. So when it comes to plants, many games insist that a plant is only worth something if it can be interacted with and be ripped off from the ground and be turned into something useful, right? One example comes from Fallout 4, where plants can be turned into food or money. And actually what you can do in Fallout 4 is to go visit someone else's garden and harvest their crops before their eyes, sell that crop to them, and get money for it. not only will you be paid handsomely for this, you will also be thanked for doing business with them. Which means that these garden owners never owned their gardens in the first place. You're the rightful owner, right? But Fallout 4 goes a bit further. You also own everyone, the people who joins you on your plantation, right? That explains the outlines around this person here kneeling on your garden. You can command them around and assign them tasks. You basically become a plantation overseer, but more of that later. Another example is Minecraft. And when I say Minecraft, I mean it. It's actually everything that happens in the game is mine, right? So that's already in the game. Thanks for coughing. As already mentioned, flowers only become useful also in this game if you turn it into something else, like a color or a soup, for instance, which then can be traded with villagers who, by the way, and like the flowers, can also be bred for the player's enjoyment. Right? There's several tutorials on YouTube already teach gamers how to successfully breed villagers and lock them in tiny trade cells for maximum efficiency. There's very good YouTube tutorials about that. And so a popular approach in these YouTube videos is to squeeze villages into 1x1 enclosures, a pixel, where they're stuck and I think it's called block rather than pixel, right? Yeah. So 1x1 enclosures where these villages are damned to trade with you for eternity, or rather until you don't need them anymore. Because after you are done with them and their services, you can just pull a lever and they conveniently fall into the lava where they poof, disappear. And it isn't considered as recognized as death by the software, but it's actually just a happy little accident that makes a new slot available for the next villager who is already conveniently, with the help of Minecraft's water physics that are very educational, pushed from their breeding ground towards their terminal appointment, right? This is procedural slavery. And in this context, the popularity of Minecraft as innovative teaching tool, there's actually an official educational version of Minecraft available that's used widely in school. I think the game is played by over 90 million people worldwide. It gains a little bit of an odd note, right? That gains a little bit of an odd note. Because Minecraft has universally been praised as a great learning tool, but you never really see a content warning for procedural slavery anywhere. And there would also be an alternative to putting a content warning, just remove that feature. Because Minecraft in the past has actually demonstrated a history of being able to remove stuff. For instance, the option to have infinite glass in your inventory. Right? They have managed to have priorities and make the game more enjoyable, so they have managed to reduce the amount of glass that people can carry around. Yeah. Removing the option for procedural slavery or enslaving people has not been so far a priority for the 2.5 billion worth empire that is Mojang, the maker of Minecraft. I have an alternative suggestion to all of this, which is using Minecraft as a teaching tool to teach kids about the history of Western entitlement in a world where other cultures are completely objectified. So the villagers do not speak, or do they? We don't know, they make sounds. And this would be a great opportunity to teach the work of Gayatri Spivak and other post-colonial researchers, and Gayatri Spivak especially, who in 1988 already asked the question under which conditions people in colonized countries can have a voice at all, and I think it would be a great opportunity to use Minecraft to teach that. Second chapter, naming. So botany was not only about finding plants in the wild, it was also about naming them, very important feature, and even before colonial times, Europeans were obsessed with namings. We are obsessed with namings, as shown in the ritual of baptism, right? So after baptism, for everyone who might not be familiar with that concept, let's break it down. After a baby is born by a mother during a really intense labor process, baptism comes in and claims the real birth of the baby, but this time in the name of the father, to make it part of a Christian community, right? This happens through a holy cosplay ritual of sorts, by men baptizing the child in the name of the father. So basically this ritual says, let's say this whole mother, this awkward thing didn't happen. It's the midwife, priest men who carry out the real initiation of the child by spraying it with like holy water from an artificial pool womb thingy, right? So in German, which is kind of funny, is my mother tongue, you might have guessed by now. This has a special twist because the name of this pool is the same as pelvis, Becken, right? It's the same name. So one important thing in this cosplay ritual is also the male midwife priest, like the main midwife, has some holy spells that are used to seal the deal, right? And these spells are holy because no one can understand them because Latin, right? So the same kind of happens in botany, or botany just learns from this. And they also use Latin spells, but this time we have moved from a religious superstition and God to some rational science guys naming all the things, right? So we have a different kind of religion, and the dude to the right, Carl Linné, comes up with a naming system that supposedly works for everything, all plants and all things of all time, in all regions, but mainly used in Sweden, where he's from. So the official term for the system, fancy as it is called binomial nomenclature, and that basically meant each plant is baptized with a first Latin name and a small surname, like Carl Linné, for instance. So somehow Linné's system went absolutely viral because it was super useful to everyone. And it came with some features that were good for the empire, basically. They were good to be monetized, I think you say today, I don't know. So here are three of these features. The first feature of binomial nomenclature is it set up the world for classification, meaning whatever is named exists. So a plant from now on only existed if it has been classified according to this schema, and anything that didn't meet this classification could be dismissed, right? And so including all the locally available knowledge that existed and did not really match this classification. Secondly, the second feature is that coming up with the fancy genus and species names was a kind of sneaky way to make qualitative judgments. So yes, if something was poorly understood or just considered ugly or worthless, it was just given like that name in an encrypted Latin way, right? So if also the opposite, if Linné liked someone really, really much, he devoted a beautiful plant and called them after their friend's name. For instance, Per Kalm and Gautier, there's two plants that are also his friends. So naming is a way of branding and trademarking, really showing the world out there that you're going places, right? Like you got a flower devoted to you, that's kind of cute. So thirdly, classification made sure that white male European knowledge was perceived as the only knowledge there was. That's kind of a consequence of this. So basically the summary is that if a white man from Europe didn't name a plant, it doesn't exist. So according to this self-fulfilling troll logic, what might call it, this is also evidence that white men were in fact the only civilized people out there, and keeping kind of the wisdom to civilize them all. So what are examples for this kind of behavior in game culture? So here are just some preliminary suggestions. First, there's the impulse to label all the things, all the games, which is also most prominently expressed in game labels and tags. So currently everything that's out there on the market as a game can be labeled according to to certain genre expectations, or it's not a game, right? We know this, it's not a game. So for some reason, we still really collectively crave this kind of labeling. It's also not confined to the marketplace. The market I work in, academia, folks are obsessed with defining games, play, gamefulness and playfulness, giving that stuff labels. And conspicuously, this is how the authors of some of the most popular definitions look like. You might maybe see on the slide, they have something in common, right? They have some features in common. So given the popularity of the definitions that they came up, this is just a popular, it's not a whole picture. Apologize in advance, no, not sorry. But these are very people who have made popular game definitions. So given the popularity of these definitions, one might wonder, has the logic of white men naming things traveled from botany to games? And if a white man hasn't baptized a game, does it exist? Also, what does this tradition of having things defined by white men, how does this impact game culture? So, because secondly, there are some genre labels which are only accepted grudgingly and over time, and which make a difference between good games or proper games and bad games, or not non-games, not games. Think of walking simulators. Walking simulators is one of these examples. So walking simulators started out as a slur to delegitimize games, and like Dear Esther and Gone Home, which according to some gamers shouldn't be regarded as games, right? Since then, walking simulators have found their way into common usage, indicating a genre of their own. However, it still comes with negative connotations, or at least some doubt. Yes, and the third aspect is of this naming tradition is in game development, fancy terminology can create harmful assumptions around who is allowed to like games, like the fan base, and who isn't, and who is for instance, who is invited into voice chats. There's a study on that about Xbox, the Xbox universe, and how it engages in racial profiling, or at least some of the audiences. And also at this year's GDC, Bo Rubrick has talked about harassment that game educators potentially face when talking about queer games, for instance. Yes, let's jump to the next point because we're short on time. So pruning. Pruning is a horticultural practice that refers to cutting and trimming. And also kind of maintaining a garden. And it's a bit of a paradox, because the idea of pruning is that leaving plants in their natural state is unnatural. So in order to transform a plant into something good, it must be pruned, right? It must be cultivated, it must be civilized. So this requires a constant regime of maintenance, the constant ritual of cutting back, watering, putting into form, fertilizing, and so on. So, for example, colonial gardening is obsessed with hedges and lawns, and these are one of the most high maintenance things to garden, as some gardening experts might approve. So, it is one thing to plant a lawn, but maintaining a lawn is something completely different. Next to fertilizers and a lot of water, one also needs the right hardware to do the job, right? So trimmers, mowers, and even then there might be weeds sprouting at the edge, which is super annoying because you want the lawn to be one straight line. So pruning is an expensive activity, but according to colonial logic, it's necessary. It's needed in order to paradoxically keep nature in a natural state. So only then the beauty of nature can shine through, as in this beautiful Viennese botanical garden. So like colonial botanists, video game developers are obsessed with producing nature more beautiful and real than reality itself, reaching a state of perfection. This can be seen in the quest for hyperrealism, the creation of real-time reflection, or L systems, and believable AI, which cost enormous amount of money. And So, like in botany, this requires a range of expensive tools and expertise, specialized skills, and processing power. So, no technical solution seems too far-fetched when it comes to creating our digital video game gardens, in the hopes that some players will enjoy to just walk through them, right? And have a little bit of a feeling and an experience. So I call this cutting-edge technology. And so by cutting-edge technology, I mean the ridiculously expensive tools, just using them for the sake of making game worlds more real than reality itself. Agent of Empire. So by now it's clear that there's a lot of work that's being put into gardening during that time of botanical, of colonial botany. And so the next question is, who does that work, right? And I'm afraid the answers to this question might also matter to understand the video games industry today. So basically the story of work in colonial gardening is the story of two places, the center and the periphery. So we've already casually looked at these two places. The center is the home of the science dudes you've seen before, naming all the things. And the European quote-unquote civilized capitals where knowledge work is being made, right? The knowledge centers. And here you see a typical science gathering of Louis XIV and members of the Académie des Sciences. And you can already see that the knowledge work is expensive because basically these science parties don't pay for themselves, right? Like there's stuff going on here. And when you look closely, you can see a lot of expensive hardware. Like you see maybe some maps, some contraptions, and so on. But most importantly, we see this. I'm not sure whether you spotted this, like this. And this is not just like a guy hanging out in the back looking metal, but this is actually the tool of medical science, right? So imagine back in these days, the most science lovers were super into this theory of that Europeans are superior, right? And how could we tell? Yes, through the language of bones. Exciting. Bones. And they even had a fancy name for it, craniometry. So skull science, that was really big back then. And it was quite a hit in the colonial age because it explained why the bad skull people had to be slaves, right? A really easy framework, can also monetize that. Unfortunately, it was, let's say, it was not really unaffected by contemporary racism. Right? So the differences between different types of skull were interpreted according to racist stereotypes. To the left, we see the actual apparatus that was used to measure skulls, and to the right, there was this hierarchy that kind of came out of that measurements, random measurements, and they kind of divided people into different, this is actually the hierarchies of human value, right? So humans who worked in the center, of course, were on the top, and humans who were naturally more inclined to work in the peripheries for no pay were like in the bottom. So back in the day, it was super scientific and also godly, because God was always like part of science here, to plant sugar, coffee, and cotton on slave plantations, and there were also laws backing that up. For instance, the Barbados Slave Code from 1661 that basically classified the slave as plantation inventory, a bit like Fallout 4 does with these outlines, right? It's like actually the same logic. It's also a games for learning, I guess, for this kind of chapter of history. So, yeah, there's also the humans that are not being paid. They work in the plantations. They're also surveilled or like taken care of, kind of, by a plantation overseer. You hopefully see there. That's like in the center of the image. That's the only dude wearing a tuxedo and a top hat at 35 degrees Celsius. So luckily things have changed from then, right? But for instance, we now know that craniometry does not measure anything except our own racism. And we now know that there's only one race, the human race, and so on, and that we're different but we're equal. But there's some things which are still to be fixed and which kind of date back to this age. All these dysfunctional dynamics between center and periphery, they have left deep wounds. And like in the word of Toni Morrison, who put it like this, in an interview with cultural scholar Paul Gilroy, slavery broke the world in half, broke it every way. It broke Europe, it made them into something else, it made them slave masters, it made them crazy. And by them, she means us. So back to games. Lately, we keep hearing disheartening stories about working conditions in the games industry, horrendous job insecurity, living in constant fear of being laid off, being exploited, so on. Slowly, unions are forming against that to fight the hyper-capitalism in these spaces and improve workers' condition. But as tragic as these stories are, they are also tales from the center, not from the periphery, right? They're the centers of game production, Europe, North America, and so on. The peripheries of hardware production are elsewhere. They're in China, Taiwan, Singapore, Mexico, Malaysia. In huge high-tech plantations, low-wage, unskilled workers assemble video game parts in what can only be called a lifelong crunch, right? And these people still don't have the economic means usually to enjoy these games. So Phone Story is a game that's actually been made by someone from Italy, Paolo Pedagini. It's a phone stories for iPhones, has been also banned from the App Store, which comments on some of these pretty dim labor conditions of global hardware production. First, we make kids mine cobalt in the Republic of Congo, then we catch suicidal Foxconn workers in Shenzhen, China, with a suicide prevention net, and finally we disassemble highly toxic electronic waste on one of the dumping grounds, which could be anywhere from in the global south, Ghana, Pakistan, Brazil, or China, right? Yet, when I think of Workers Unite, what I'm thinking about mainly is my edgy game developers friends and how they might survive in the business. Why am I not thinking about my Chinese friend who work unpaid overtime at Foxconn and earn a total of $550 a month? One answer is that I live in a world which is still divided into center and periphery, right? And where I am in the center, I'm an individual, right? I'm an individual. I'm not a part of the system, and that's kind of ironic because game developers are often told that we should be interested in systems. A bit of a paradox. Bit of a delusion that kind of maybe relates to Toni Morrison's quote. Okay, let's move to the threats. There always have been threats to this kind of game gardening, right? To colonial game gardening. The properly pruned gardens. In spite of technology and the maintenance in these regimes, weeds are growing at the edge, right? In a perfectly mowed lawn anywhere. So these weeds are persistent, and if we let them alone, they will win and take over through biodiversity, right? Just do nothing and it will solve itself, maybe. No, that's not the lesson here. But diversity is the worst enemy of colonial game gardening. This is nowhere more pronounced than this silly nomenclature of indiepocalypse. Like indiepocalypse, which is a term made up to blame the increasing number of small game makers for the fact that video games are not exponentially profitable, right? So kind of like, why can't I make a platformer with a twist and be set forever? Like, for instance, Fez or Braid, or not calling names here. But in a fair world, such profits shouldn't have been possible in the first place, right? So the indiepocalypse is, in fact, a healthy thing. It opens a dysfunctional industry to small makers. And it's the wrong frame to call that bad weeds or something which need to be eliminated from closely controlled game gardens. But there are other ways of talking about biodiversity in game design. For instance, what if we change the discourse from gardening to living with the land? There are local knowledges available about nature which do not neatly fit into gardening models. And this can be an opportunity to challenge exclusionary, supremacist ways of making games. In Sami culture, in Northern Europe's indigenous people's communities, there is a concept called kuksi, or kuksa in Finnish. And kuksi is a mark which is carved out of birch wood, but what is special is that only the sick tree parts are used for carving kuksi. So you can see that to the left, these are the kind of tree parts that are used. So kuksi are maybe are made from cancers, from outgrowths that could never be used for anything in industrial production. Instead of using any wood and forcing it into a deliberate shape, kuksi are carved based on what's made available by the abundance of nature already. So even and especially a sick tree can give this particular wood, which is required to actually make the most sustainable way of, it's required for the most sustainable cup that can be made. I'm almost finished, 2 slides left. So what I'm not trying to do as a white person is to promote stealing indigenous traditions here, but rather learning from this approach to see what grows where you live. So we might think of the increasing number of small, diverse makers as vernacular botanists. So in botany, vernacular, also in linguistics, it means unofficial local ways of describing plants. Such botanists live with the land and develop knowledges that don't match the criteria of the system, but just actually respond in a dialogue to what's there. And here, I suggest there are some vernacular botanists in games that I admire, and I could shout out to them. So Cook Your Way on the top left is a physical installation, a cooking station, in which players literally process the story of an immigrant trying to make sense of all the red tape they are faced in a new, strange country through the metaphor of cooking. Ritual of the Moon next to it is a 28-day-long narrative-driven game about power, loneliness, and healing. And the game is a daily meditational activity composed of a memory game, drawing symbols, receiving a mantra, and making a decision about the future of the Earth. Space Bubble Cat is an interactive fiction game made in the absolutely fantastic Bitsy editor. And we help a lonely cat float through comic panels and help her find friends and learn about boundaries. That's what Space Cat is about. Space Bubble Cat. Robot Slow Dance is exactly what it sounds like. It's 2 tiny, blocky robots which are moved within a playful installation. And they want to learn the art of physical intimacy but cannot quite reach each other yet. Then, finally, the Crying Game is another Bitsy game in which we play as tears running down on a crier's face. And each tear tells the story of its origin. Yes. So, in conclusion, here's what these creators do, in my mind, to practice vernacular botany. Instead of roaming strange lands and collecting what seems exotic, and therefore prestigious, these vernacular botanists develop a deep relationship with the land on which they currently live and listen to its complex contextual needs. Instead of describing the land through a binary nomenclature or some external terms, they have learned feature lists, as it were, or bullet points, USB, unique selling points. Vernacular botanists dare to tell complex stories and rich anecdotes, which is just that, anecdotes. Vernacular botanists know that nature is flexible, and they honor this reality instead of trying to capture games through simplistic labels. And instead of trimming and cutting ideas, there is a curiosity in how the land will turn out to grow and where it needs support and where it doesn't need support. They stop policing an artificial boundary between the lawn and the weeds through high-tech, hardware, software, and so on. Instead of becoming forced into beauty, the land becomes what it can be. It becomes wild. It becomes us. Thanks.